So one way you can think about comparisons between Marxism and the utilitarian tradition is that both have a micro story and a macro story. So when you think about the utilitarian tradition, we have the micro story of the Pareto principle and how each individual transaction will go. And then we have a macro story that if you allow people to transact freely, you get the most efficient utilitarian result over time. And so you get the rights-utility synthesis, at least in the aspiration. Another way of putting that is what Adam Smith famously referred to as an invisible hand theory, that while no individual participant is interested in generating an efficient aggregate outcome, indeed each individual participant is just trying to get on as high an indifference curve as possible, the byproduct of their collective, individually selfish actions is this beneficent overall result. And so that's the invisible hand of the market that Smith talks about in The Wealth of Nations. Marx, too, has a micro story, a macro story, and an invisible hand theory. And that's what we're going to spend today's lecture and next Monday's lecture talking about. Today, principally, we're going to focus on his micro story, his story of how wealth gets created at the micro level under capitalism. And then we will link it on Monday to his macro story. And he, too, you will see, has an invisible hand theory. That is to say, the particular players at the micro level confront incentives to behave in certain ways. And the byproduct of their actions is a macro result which nobody understands or intends. The difference is, we'll see that for Marx, the invisible hand isn't entirely benevolent. It's benevolent for a while, but then it starts to become malevolent over time because of the way that the dynamics of capitalism play themselves out. So that's the sort of where we're headed in the medium term in the next couple of lectures. I want, though, before heading into the micro story, to make a couple of conceptual points. Remember that when we look at Enlightenment thinkers, we're concerned first and foremost with the fact that they are all motivated by the idea of individual freedom as the highest good and basing politics on scientific principles rather than appeals to custom or natural law or religion or tradition or anything else. And I just want to highlight what Marx's assumptions about those two things are. I've actually mentioned these in one way or another in last Monday's lecture, but just to emphasize, first of all, the idea of freedom in Marx is captured beautifully in this very famous passage that he wrote, actually, to relatively young Marx, his critique of the Hegelians and their followers Feuerbach in a work called The German Ideology. He has this very vivid description of what he means by unfreedom, the antithesis of his ideal. He says, the division of labor, which we talked about last time, offers us the first example. As long as man remains in natural society, that is, as long as a cleavage exists between the particular and the common interest, as long, therefore, as activity is not voluntary, not naturally divided, man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him. For as soon as the division of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced, don't write this down, I'll put the slides up, you can get them on the internet. So as soon as the division of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity which is forced upon him and which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critical critic, and he must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in a communist society, this is his utopian ideal, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, Society regulates the general production and makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. This is maybe the most famous line in all of Marx. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, and criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critic. So this is a utopian Marx, this idea that as soon as you have a division of labor, we're no longer free. We're enslaved to our particular place in the division of labor. Remember what I read to you from Adam Smith's description of the pin factory. You know, somebody spends their whole life stretching that wire for the pin. Somebody spends their whole life putting the heads on the pin. That's the sense in which Marx wants to say we're alienated from our true selves once the division of labor sets in, and we can only return to being fully rounded human beings at one with ourselves when the division of labor ultimately is abolished. And a precondition for that is the superabundance of wealth that capitalism is historically destined to create. And how we will finally get there is the story, Marx believed, of how his macro theory would play out over time. And we will only reach a communist society where people can be genuinely free once the need for a division of labor has been obviated by the existence of a superabundance of wealth. So all of that's coming, but this is just to underscore that his basic ideal is freedom and not equality, and his argument is going to be, as I said to you last time, that the condition for the free development of each is the free development of all. Second, just to come back to his and underscore his theory of science. Marx is an objectivist. He believes that there are forces operating in history, which he calls the materialist conception of history, which shape the way history unfolds. History has a direction. It's moving through a variety of phases, each of which has internal contradictions, and the way they play themselves out is going to determine what happens. So the tension in a feudal society between the peasants and the lords is going to determine the way in which conflict in that society occurs. Then you'll get the emergence of a bourgeois class, and they will create capitalism, but that will bring forth a working class who will get into conflicts with them. And as those conflicts play out, you'll eventually get communism and socialism. It's a reductionist theory. As I said to you before, think of Bill Clinton's line, it's the economy, stupid. Most of what happens, if not all of what happens that's of any importance in politics, is determined by economic interests. Whether people understand this or not, or agree with it or not, is beside the point. And that brings us to a third element of this Marxian science that I just want to underscore, which will be relevant for today's lecture, is that Marx makes a distinction between a class in itself and a class for itself. And I want to spend a couple of minutes on first his definition of class and then this in itself, for itself distinction. A lot of people say that Marx is anti-individual. He's not individualist because he thinks about things in terms of classes and class conflict. That is a very superficial reading of Marx. As a very eminent scholar called Jan Elster has pointed out in many books that he's written on the subject. Actually, Marx is an individualist because if you look at how he defines classes, he defines them by reference to the way in which the way in which individuals relate to the means of production. So what is it that makes you working class as opposed to a member of the capitalist class? What makes you working class is if you have to sell your labor power to somebody else in order to live. So if you want to know whether somebody's working class, you say, does he have to sell his labor power to somebody else in order to live or not? If the answer is yes, he's working class. If the answer is no, he's not working class. So you might say, well, I have to come in here and work every day to get paid my salary. I have to sell my labor to the university in that sense. But I'm not working class. You might think, somebody else might tell me I'm working class, but they can speak for themselves. I drive a nice car. I live in the suburbs. I'm not working class. Marx's answer is to appeal to this distinction between a class in itself and a class for itself. The answer is, Shapiro, you're just deluded. You might think you're not working class, but that's because you don't understand your objective position in the division of labor. You are working class whether you understand it or not. And that's a class, I'm working class in the class in itself sense. I'm not working class in the class for itself if I don't believe that I'm working class. So the in itself represents the objective definition of class. The for itself is the subjective. Okay, whether people actually believe they're working class and perceive themselves to be working class. But what matters for the movement of history is the in itself. What's ultimately going to drive everything is the logic, the objective logic of class conflict, not the subjective logic of what people think is their position in the social division of labor. So it's important to keep those two things separate. Now, Marx, as I've already said, was a utopian thinker, and he does ultimately want to say, for reasons that I'll get into later today and in more depth on Monday, he does ultimately want to say that what differentiates a communist revolution from all previous revolutions is that these two things will become synonymous. That for the first time in history, the working class for itself will come to see itself as the working class in itself. We will understand our objective position in the division of labor and self-consciously create the new order. Whereas in all previous modes of production, people don't really understand their position in the objective scheme of things, and so they create orders as invisible hands, to go back to Adam Smith's term. They create orders as byproducts of their intended activities, not as products of their intentional design. And so that's that distinction between in itself and for itself. Now, you might listen to all of this and you could say, well, it's a kind of quaint 19th century idea, but it doesn't have much to do with the way people live in the world today. After all, as we have all noticed with great intensity in the past year and a half of the financial crisis, many people who work for wages also have money in the stock market. Well, but then they're capitalists, aren't they? Because stock is capital. So, I have my retirement money, my TIA CREF, as college professors get it, in the stock market. So I'm an owner of capital as well as a worker. And this sort of binary distinction between the working class and the capitalist class, it's just too simple-minded. What do you think Marx would say to that? Anybody? Any takers? I'm not really working class because, I've got money and I have stocks invested in all kinds of things, mutual funds. No. So I'm not really working class. Anyone think what Marx might say to that? Not easy. I think that what he would say is this. He would say, well, the definition of working class is that you have to work for somebody else in order to live. Not that you choose to work for somebody else in order to live. So if I have enough money in my TIA CREF invested in the stock market that I can quit tomorrow and do just fine, then I'm not working class. So it's this element of compulsion that makes you working class. So it's not important from Marx's point of view that some of us might own stocks. But if we really owned enough stock that we were not in this position of having to work for somebody else in order to live, we wouldn't be working class. And so people could move in and out of the working class. Indeed, I know people on the Yale faculty who 2 years ago were about to retire and live off their accumulated TIA CREF. And then it went up in smoke when the wheels came off the economy. And now they're not retiring. So what Marx would say was, well, they managed to get out of the working class in theory, in principle, but then they fell back down into the working class. So it's this element of compulsion. They're not retiring because they don't have enough, and therefore they have to work for somebody else in order to live. So that's the distinction between a class in itself and a class for itself that drives his theory. Okay, so what is the theory? We're back to Locke. Those of you who read Chapter 5 of the Second Treatise carefully when we looked at Locke and his theory of property saw how for Locke the workmanship ideal plays out in the economic realm with the proposition that most of the value of a product comes from work. Very crude in Locke. At one point he says, 90% of it comes from work, the rest is natural resources. At another point he says 99% of it comes from work, the rest is natural resources. But Locke doesn't really have any mechanism by which labor supposedly creates value. And in the 17th and 18th century, there were really three theories floating around. There were, as I think I mentioned to you on Monday, there were in Europe, particularly France, the physiocrats who said value comes from the land. But there were English theorists who looked at them and said, no, that can't be right because look how rich Holland is, and they don't have a lot of land, and so they thought value came from trade. But then the third group, starting in the 17th century with Hobbes, Sir William Petty, Locke, and others, said, no, value comes from work. The source of value is work. And that's what Marx picks up on in trying to develop a theory of value. And his theory is more refined than Locke's, more refined than Smith's, and more refined than Ricardo's. It starts with this idea of socially necessary labor time, or SNELT. And he defines SNELT as the labor time required to produce any use value. Remember, anyone remind us what is a use value? Monday's lecture. What's a yes?
Is it useful?
Right, so anything with utility is a use value, right? So it's the amount of labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of the labor prevalent in the society. So let's suppose Leonid and I are making typewriters. One of the big sort of conundrums of labor theories of value had been, well, what if Leonid is a perfectionist and he spends twice as long making his typewriter as I spend making my typewriter? But, most of the perfectionism is actually in his own head because at the end of the day, they're the same. Marx would say, he would not say, Leonid's typewriter was worth twice Shapiro's typewriter because he put twice as much labor into it? No, because half of his labor would be socially unnecessary. So it's socially necessary labor time. Or if a new labor-saving device was created so that the keys could be made much more quickly than our laborious doing it with file. And I use the new machine, the labor-saving device, and Leonid doesn't, so my typewriters get produced more quickly. His typewriter is not going to sell for more than my typewriter because, again, he's using socially unnecessary labor. So that's the notion of the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in the society at the time. So that's what's going to determine the value of commodities, the long-term. Remember we talked about the natural value, the long-term equilibrium price of a commodity is going to be determined by the amount of labor power that is socially necessary to produce it. And this idea of socially necessary includes everybody working at the same or an average intensity, and it includes using available technologies, because if some use them and others don't, those who don't are going to be deploying unnecessary labor time, and that's not going to be reflected in the value of the product, because in a competitive market, the most cheaply priced commodity is going to beat the others out. Important to remember, Marx works with a model of a perfectly competitive economy, right, in which equivalence exchange for equivalence. No cheating, I mentioned that on Monday. Okay, his model is a perfectly competitive economy, at least at the beginning. He's got a view about how economies evolve over time to become uncompetitive, and we'll get to that. But initially, and in his analytic story, in a competitive economy, the most cheaply produced products are going to drive out the less cheaply produced, and so it's socially necessary labor time, not average, not actual. Doesn't matter how much blood, sweat, and tears Leonid actually uses. What counts is how much he needs to use. Okay. So that you could say, okay, but that's not the beginning of the whole story. And to get into that, we have to go a step further with Marx and look not just at the labor theory of value, but the labor theory of surplus value. This is where the rubber meets the road for Marx. What he wants to say is, living human labor power is the only source of fresh value, of exchange value. So this is the workmanship ideal on crack. Okay. Living human labor power is the only source of fresh value. So when Locke said, you know, work is 90%, or maybe it's 99% of the value of commodities and the rest comes from the common, Marx is going to say it's 100%. All exchange value comes from work. And what he's thinking of here is two things. One is he wants to say, if you look at all the commodities that are produced in a market economy, the one thing they all have in common is that they're products of human work. It's the single common denominator, right? It is the capacity to work is a commodity like any other, so that we'll get into this in more detail in a minute, but when you think about what it is that people are paid, what is it that a worker is paid, it's determined like the value of any other commodity. So when we say, What is the value of a book? It's determined by the amount of labor power necessary to produce that book. And when we say, what is the value of a steel worker? It's determined by the amount of labor power necessary to produce that steel worker. The worker is a commodity in just the same sense as the book is a commodity. So wages are determined by the costs of producing the worker. And the reason a physicist gets paid more than a manual labor then is simple. It costs more to produce the physicist than it costs to produce the manual laborer. All the training and education and so on that goes into the physicist costs more than the training and education that goes into the producing a manual laborer. So wages are not explained by the value of what the worker produces. This is one of the things people often get wrong. Values are explained by the cost of producing the worker. I'll say that again, it's important. Wages are explained not by the value of what the worker produces, but rather by the cost of producing the worker. So what do you think of that? What would somebody say? Somebody who thought this was, or what would Marx say about, why is a Michelangelo painting worth so much? Or why does a professional baseball player get tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars if this is true? Anyone think of what Marx would say? Anyone want to guess? Yeah.
What do you say? It's because like how much time they had to practice and how much like money and time they put into learning their skills?
That would be part of it, but still, you know, I mean, there are only so many hours in a day. How do you get up to a $100 million salary? I mean, you're on the right track. What else goes into the creation of a Major League Baseball player? Why don't they have very good Major League Baseball players in Britain? Because they don't have minor leagues, they don't have farm teams. There's these huge costs associated with getting the one brilliant, best of all time player. So that's what he would have to say. Or if you think about the value of a Michelangelo painting, it's not just the training of Michelangelo, it's all those failed painters that all those popes wasted all that money investing in. Right? That all goes in some indirect sense, into the wage differential. So that's sort of what it's. Of course, it is a stretch, and one thing that Marx did not think about was what we call in economics today winner-take-all markets. Anyone know what a winner-take-all market is? What's a winner-take-all market? What does the phrase suggest to you? What do you think a winner-take-all market could be? Think about the wage differential between the major leagues and minor leagues baseball. It's huge, right? That's a winner-take-all market. The way you can think about it is before the advent of the gramophone record, being a really pretty good opera singer you'd do pretty well. Every major city would have, you know, an opera with a pretty good opera singer, would make a good living. Once you have the gramophone record, then everybody can buy Pavarotti, right? So then whether or not the difference between Pavarotti and the next best and the third best opera singer becomes much more important. So that's the idea of a winner-take-all market. And Marx had nothing to say about them. So he would have to reach for this rather contorted logic of saying it just costs much more to produce the best baseball player in the world because you have to run everything that goes into that production. Not only his own practicing and training, but everything that goes with it. So that's the first point. Labor power is a commodity, and its exchange value or its price is determined by what it costs to produce it. But then this is the magic. This is the workmanship ideal on crack. This is the idea. He wants to say that living human labor power is a unique commodity in that its consumption as a use value leads to the creation of fresh exchange value. What does this mean? It means that suppose I have some money and I spend, $1,000 on a wonderful meal with good wine. At the end of that meal, it's gone. Right? I pay the check and it's gone. I've consumed it. Whereas if I had spent that $1,000 hiring one of you to paint one wall in my home, when it's done, my home's worth something more because it has freshly painted wall. That's what he means. Okay, so that living human labor power differs from other commodities in that its consumption as a use value leads to the creation of fresh exchange value. Right? You eat the meal, it's gone, but you consume the labor power of the person painting your house or the person working in your factory, and it's not gone. Right? The labor power is gone in the sense that it's been expended, those calories have been spent, but you have something of greater value. You have a house that's worth more than it was before you hired that person to paint it. And that's what makes labor power unique. Right? And he wants to say, it is the only source of fresh value. Okay. So a couple of just terms here to get straight his archaic language. You probably read, he makes a distinction between what he calls constant capital and variable capital. All of that, all you need to think about there is capital is what the capitalist spends in the productive process. Variable capital is wages, and constant capital is everything else. Sometimes he uses these symbols. C means all capital. Big C means all capital. Little c means everything the capitalist spends on things other than wages. And V is spent on wages. And why he might call it variable, so the idea is that wages are always driven toward subsistence. This is an empirical assumption. Marx makes a few empirical assumptions. Of all the empirical assumptions he makes, this is the one that actually is the most accurate. He wants to say that there are always some unemployed in capitalist economies. And because there are always some unemployed in capitalist economies, wages will be driven towards subsistence. Because if you have, say, a union that organizes and drives up wages, the employer will then go and hire non-union workers and say, well, will you work for me at something lower than the union wage? And the answer will be yes, because the unemployed worker won't have a choice. Okay, so wages will be driven towards subsistence. Now that puts on the table another question. Well, what is subsistence? What is subsistence? And Marx does say, well, it has a social and historical element. So that is to say, in a society like ours, the definition of subsistence might include having enough money to buy a car in order to drive to work, whereas obviously that was not true in 19th century Britain. So what counts as subsistence changes, and we'll see there are other features of Marx's theory of capitalism which show that there's actually an inbuilt impetus for what counts as subsistence to go up. But at any given time, the accepted level of subsistence and wages will be driven toward that because of the existence of what he flamboyantly describes as the reserve army of the unemployed, right? That's what keeps wages at subsistence or close to it in a competitive economy. Okay. Let's do a little micro transaction. Suppose there's a working day, okay? And suppose the accepted working day is 10 hours long. Marx says, well, think about what the worker is doing. The worker, is producing cotton, let's say. It doesn't really matter what. And for some portion of that working day, the cotton that he's producing, when eventually sold, is going to cover the cost of his wages. So the worker produces cotton all day long, and the capitalist eventually sells the cotton, right, and gets something for it, and then he's got to pay his worker his wage. And we're just going to say, for the purposes of this example, the work that's done in the first 4 hours is going to cover the wage bill, and the rest is what Marx calls surplus. So that's the difference between necessary and surplus labor time. And Marx has the idea of a rate of exploitation, which is the ratio of necessary to surplus labor time. You could even make a little index, and so you'd say it's 1.5. Okay, so this is the capitalist, the value that's produced that covers the wage bill. This is the rest. Of course, this isn't all profit, right? Why isn't it profit? Why isn't all of that profit? Somebody. Think about it. You're a capitalist. Yeah.
Because some money goes to the actual, I guess, building where they're working, or other, or even material needed to create the product.
Exactly. The capitalist has to buy raw material, has to do advertising, has to have a system of managers, research and development. All of that has to be paid out of this. So profit is, some subset of this, but it's not all of this. Okay. So we're in the cotton business, and it's a competitive business. And so another cotton manufacturer says, you know what? I think these workers are slacking it. I'm going to say from now on to my workers, you work 11 hours. Wages are already at subsistence by assumption, right? So, the workers might say, no, we're not, and they say, you can say, goodbye. I'll get somebody unemployed to do it then, okay? So if you do that, we now have an 11-hour working day. The rate of exploitation goes up, right? Because now there's 7 hours of surplus labor rather than 6 hours of surplus labor. You might say, well, the worker's going to get worn out sooner and die sooner. Well, let's just suspend disbelief about that and say, in fact, so this capitalist is going to do better than this capitalist. So this capitalist is going to be able to sell his or her product more cheaply, and therefore this capitalist is going to be in trouble. People think, Marxism, capitalists are afraid of the working class. No. On Marxist theory, who is a capitalist afraid of? Who is the capitalist looking over his shoulder at? Yeah, the capitalist down the street. He couldn't care less about, he's not worried about the workers. He's worried about the capitalist who can come into his industry and produce more effectively. Okay? So if you can make these workers work an extra hour, you're going to do it. And then everybody else is going to have to do it, right? Or they're going to go out of business. And this is why Marx wants to say, this is what he calls an increase in absolute surplus value. This is why Marx says, under primitive capitalism, in the early stages of capitalism, the battles are going to be over things like the length of the working day. If any of you have done 19th century British history, you will know that one of the big battles this starts with the Chartists in the early 19th century and goes on. What are they pushing for? The 10 hours bill. They want the 10 hours bill. They want Parliament to come in and say, working day is 10 hours, to limit this. So to the extent that the workers can organize politically and put pressure to get a 10 hours bill, then you limit this. But in any case, Marx wants to say, you know, there are only so many hours in a day, and people do have to sleep after all. So you're not going to get much out of this. The real secret to capitalism's dynamism is not the move from A to B, it's the move from A to C. Notice here we're back at a 10 hours day, but now by assumption I'm saying the capitalist is going to cover his wage bill for that worker in 3 hours rather than 4. How's he going to do that? Yeah. Pardon? But you can't reduce wages because wages are already at subsistence. So you're going to have to, by assumption, you have to produce the same, you have to pay the same wages. So how are you going to do it? Technology, exactly. The name of the game is technology. Somebody's going to go and buy a spinning jenny and put it in his factory, and then the workers will work way more productively, and as a result of that, the capitalist will cover his wage bill more quickly. And of course, the minute one capitalist puts the spinning jenny in, everybody has to put the spinning jenny in, right? Or else they're going to go out of business. Because the capitalist that's covering his wage bill in 3 hours of that worker's work rather than 4 is going to be able to sell the cotton more cheaply in the market and therefore outcompete the capitalist who's still using the old system. And so the way capitalism works is that there's constant pressure for technological innovation because this is not a very effective way of increasing productivity, right? You can, in the early stages, you'll see that, but there'll be political limits, 10 hours bill, there'll be natural limits, human capacity. So then all the pressure is on dynamic innovation. Okay, now, this is where it gets interesting. Because what he wants to say is, but we know that only living human labor power produces surplus value. So as you become more and more capital intensive, the capitalist is spending more and more on constant capital and less on variable capital. To put it in modern jargon, production is becoming more capital intensive. You're spending more and more of your investment on something that does not produce new value. So another way you can think about this, and this, remember I said to you last time, all the classical political economists thought they had to explain the declining tendency in the rate of profit. What Marx wants to say is, if this is the status quo, okay, and one capitalist in the cotton industry puts in the spinning jenny and this becomes the status quo, this capitalist will have higher profits than this capitalist, right? But once they've all put in the spinning jenny, the rate of profit in the cotton industry will be lower than it was up here. Okay? So there's a short run, long run conflict of interest for capitalists, because in the short run, at the margin, I will innovate and my profits will go up, but then everybody will copy me, and the rate of profit in the cotton industry will fall over time. Now, there's some dubious assumptions in that which I'm going to come back to on Monday, but I first want to just draw your attention to some of the normative aspects of this. What Marx calls the rate of exploitation, as I said, is the ratio of surplus to necessary labor time. But now look down the right-hand side here. He's got all this jargon, but you can unpack it here. S over V is the rate of exploitation. And all these things are basically equivalent ratio. But look down here, and now think about this. Suppose I was a capitalist and you were a worker working for me, okay? And suppose I said, times are tough in the cotton industry. You've got a choice. We can go to here or we can go to here. We can pick B or we can pick C. But A is no longer an option. A means I'm moving to Mexico. Can't do A anymore. So take your pick, B or C. How many are going to pick B? Hands up. How many are going to pick C? Everybody. But then it seems like this is very counterintuitive, doesn't it? Because you all went for something that, according to Marx, has a higher rate of exploitation, 2.33 as opposed to 1.75. How can that be? How can that make any sense? Okay, and I'm just going to go 2 minutes over here to leave you with this to think about, and then we'll pick up with it on Monday. This is the intuition. If you think about how people think about how well off they are, the Pareto system says, am I on a higher or lower indifference curve than I was on before? It's a bit like when Ronald Reagan was running for re-election in 1984. His slogan was, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" Right? You look at your situation and you say, what was my situation? Is it better? Is it worse? A self-referential comparison. Marx says, no, that's not the relevant comparison. The relevant comparison is other referential. You decide how well off you are, not just by reference to what you get compared to with what you got before, but by reference to what others are getting. So that in this kind of situation, if you say which is worse for the worker, they may well say that a situation in which they have more is worse than a situation in which they have less if the capitalist has even more. So Marx wants to say we're inherently other referential. What's going to make us more or less happy is not just what we have, but what we have in relation to others. So now, and it turns out on this matter he was half right. He was half right, we see, from huge number, 100 years of studies of sociology. What people find acceptable and desirable is connected to what others have, but usually it's connected, and this is where he was half wrong, it's usually connected to what people who are similarly situated to themselves have. So workers in the steel industry will compare themselves to workers in the auto industry, but workers in the auto industry will not compare themselves to what executives in the auto industry get. So people are other referential, but in a more horizontal sense. And this is true up and down the occupational scale. So if you have been a Yale administrator, one thing you will learn is it will matter much more to a professor if he or she learns he's being paid $2,000 less than the professor down the corridor than if he or she learns he or she is being paid $200,000 less than the attorney who lives next door to them. People compare themselves to others, but they compare themselves to similarly situated others. Why that is an immensely complicated and interesting subject. But it means that Marx was right to think we're basically other referential. We don't just ask the question, has my utility gone up or down? We do compare ourselves to others, but he was mistaken in thinking that that workers would compare themselves to capitalists rather than to other workers in deciding whether or not they were well off. And that would feed into his assumptions about the conditions under which workers would be likely to become militant. Okay, we'll start with that issue on Monday.